I have spent most of my professional life learning to distrust emotionally satisfying explanations, and nothing illustrates that discipline better than Russia's winter strikes on Ukraine. The facts are not in dispute. Russian forces launched a large-scale missile and drone barrage across Ukraine during sub-zero temperatures, killing at least 4 civilians, damaging a thermal power plant near Kyiv, and leaving hundreds of thousands without electricity and heating. Ukrainian authorities reported nearly 300 drones and dozens of missiles used in a single wave. Entire urban systems, not just individual targets, were stressed simultaneously, and the outages persisted for days as temperatures dropped below -9 degrees Celsius with wind chill. Those are operational facts, not propaganda. What concerns me is how quickly this was reduced to a morality play. Western commentary framed the strikes as cruelty for cruelty's sake, or as evidence of Russian desperation. That framing is comforting, but it is analytically lazy. Infrastructure warfare in winter is not new, and it is not accidental. It is a coercive strategy designed to impose cumulative stress on civilian systems, emergency services, and political decision-making. Anyone who studied Soviet operational doctrine understands that energy, transport, and logistics nodes have always been considered legitimate strategic pressure points. Treating this as irrational brutality rather than calculated pressure is an intelligence failure, not a moral insight. The distortion begins with selective observation. We count the dead, show frozen apartment blocks, and repeat official Ukrainian statements without interrogating the broader operational pattern. We rarely ask why Russia concentrates on synchronized strikes, why it times them to extreme weather, or why it continues despite sanctions and air defense losses. Instead, intelligence analysis is replaced by narrative management. The story becomes about outrage, not capability, intent, or adaptation. The strategic consequence of that distortion is predictable. Policymakers convince themselves that Russia is running out of options, that these attacks signal weakness, and that time is on Ukraine's side. That belief then feeds decisions that assume endurance alone will break Moscow's will. From an intelligence perspective, that is a catastrophic assumption. Sustained infrastructure degradation does not need to collapse a state overnight. It only needs to raise the cost of resistance month after month. The hard lesson is this: when intelligence stops asking uncomfortable questions and starts reinforcing preferred narratives, strategy becomes fiction. Winter is not just the weather in this war. It is a weapon, and pretending otherwise does not make it less effective. What I watched unfold after the winter strikes was not an intelligence failure born of missing information, but one born of misplaced priorities. The facts were available almost immediately. Ukrainian officials described the scale of the attack, the number of drones and missiles, the damage to power generation, and the resulting blackouts in sub-zero conditions. Civilian deaths were confirmed, and the targeting of energy infrastructure was openly acknowledged. None of this was hidden, ambiguous, or unknowable. Yet the way this information was processed in Washington and across Western media told me that intelligence analysis had been subordinated to headline production. In a healthy system, raw reporting triggers assessment. Analysts ask what has changed, what has remained constant, and what this says about enemy intent. Instead, the reporting pipeline now feeds directly into narrative reinforcement. The dominant question is no longer what this indicates about Russian strategy, but how it fits the story we are already telling. When intelligence serves messaging, it stops functioning as intelligence. I saw this pattern repeatedly during my government career, but the Ukraine war has institutionalized it. The winter strikes were immediately framed as proof of Russian frustration or moral bankruptcy. Those may be emotionally satisfying conclusions, but they are not analytical ones. There was little serious discussion about why Russia continues to allocate scarce precision weapons to infrastructure targets, why it accepts international condemnation as a cost of doing business, or why these strikes persist despite Western aid flows. Those questions threaten the preferred storyline, so they are ignored. This is how intelligence becomes fiction. Analysts learn, often unconsciously, which conclusions are rewarded and which are career-ending. Over time, assessment narrows. Reports emphasize resilience narratives, downplay systemic vulnerabilities, and treat operational continuity as collapse in waiting. The result is a closed loop where policymakers cite intelligence that reflects their own assumptions, then use those citations to justify decisions that further entrench the assumptions. The strategic consequence is profound. When leaders believe their own headlines, they misjudge timelines, thresholds, and escalation dynamics. They assume the adversary is nearer to breaking than the evidence supports. In Ukraine's case, this has meant underestimating the cumulative impact of repeated infrastructure degradation during winter conditions and overestimating the political leverage created by sanctions and moral pressure alone. The hard lesson here is not about Russia. It is about us. An intelligence community that confuses reporting volume with understanding and moral clarity with strategic clarity will always be surprised by outcomes it should have anticipated. Headlines are not assessments. When we treat them as such, we trade foresight for comfort. One of the most persistent distortions I hear repeated is that Russia's focus on infrastructure proves it cannot win on the battlefield. That claim sounds plausible until you examine it with an intelligence lens instead of a political one. Infrastructure targeting is not a consolation prize for a failing military. It is a deliberate method of shaping the operational environment over time. The winter strikes that damaged power plants, disrupted heating, and left hundreds of thousands without electricity were not improvisations. They followed a pattern visible since 2022, one that becomes more consequential as temperatures drop and repair cycles lengthen. The myth begins with a false dichotomy. Western narratives often imply a choice between fighting armies and targeting infrastructure, as if a state must do one or the other. Real war does not work that way. States apply pressure across multiple systems simultaneously. Russia's strikes on energy grids do not replace ground operations, they complement them. They strain logistics, degrade command and control resilience, complicate mobilization, and impose persistent stress on civilian governance. Calling this desperation is not analysis. It is wishful thinking. Intelligence distortion enters when analysts assume that because infrastructure attacks provoke outrage, they must therefore be irrational. That assumption ignores doctrine, history, and precedent. From Allied bombing campaigns in World War II to NATO operations in the Balkans, infrastructure has always been a target when the goal is coercion rather than immediate territorial gain. The difference in Ukraine is not the method, but the refusal to acknowledge what the method is designed to achieve. The strategic consequence of believing the infrastructure myth is that policymakers underestimate endurance warfare. They focus on dramatic battlefield breakthroughs while dismissing the slow degradation of urban life as politically irrelevant. In reality, repeated blackouts in winter conditions erode public morale, strain municipal budgets, and force governments to divert resources from military needs to emergency repairs. None of this guarantees capitulation, but it steadily raises the cost of resistance. Intelligence professionals are supposed to measure costs, not assume outcomes. What troubles me most is how this myth shields decision makers from accountability. If infrastructure attacks are framed as meaningless cruelty, then there is no need to reassess strategy when they continue month after month. Failure becomes impossible because success is defined emotionally rather than operationally. That is how intelligence loses its corrective function. The hard lesson is simple and uncomfortable. Infrastructure warfare works incrementally, not theatrically. Dismissing it as a sign of weakness blinds policymakers to the very pressures that shape war termination. When intelligence communities propagate that dismissal, they are not informing strategy. They are protecting narratives. One of the most damaging illusions sustained by Western intelligence assessments is the belief that Ukrainian urban resilience can indefinitely offset systemic dependence on centralized infrastructure. I do not question the determination of the Ukrainian population. What I question is the analytical laziness that treats determination as a substitute for electricity, heat, water, and logistics. When hundreds of thousands of people around Kyiv lose power in sub-zero temperatures after coordinated missile and drone strikes, that is not a morale story. It is a system story. Modern cities are not resilient by default. They are efficient, and efficiency creates dependence. High-rise housing relies on electricity for elevators, heating systems, water pumps, and communications. When power grids are degraded, cascading failures follow. Water pressure drops, pipes freeze and burst, emergency services slow, and hospitals shift to generators with finite fuel. These are not theoretical vulnerabilities. They are observable consequences reported repeatedly during winter outages. Yet, Western analysis often treats them as temporary inconveniences rather than structural stress points. The illusion persists because intelligence reporting is filtered through political need. Emphasizing Ukrainian dependence risks undermining the narrative of inexhaustible resilience, and that narrative underpins continued Western policy. So assessments highlight rapid repairs and volunteer efforts while downplaying cumulative degradation. What is rarely examined is how each repair cycle consumes resources, manpower, and time that cannot be allocated elsewhere. Over months, that diversion matters. The strategic consequence of this illusion is miscalculated sustainability. Policymakers assume that as long as frontline lines hold, the state holds. That assumption ignores the rear. War is not only fought at the front, it is sustained in cities. Russia's winter strikes exploit that reality by forcing Kyiv to prioritize survival functions over long-term planning. The objective is not to cause immediate collapse, but to narrow choices. Intelligence should be identifying that narrowing. Instead, it reassures. From an intelligence perspective, dependence is not a moral failing. It is a condition to be measured. Every system has thresholds. When analysts refuse to discuss them openly, those thresholds are crossed without warning. I have seen this before in other conflicts, where optimism replaced assessment and surprise followed. The hard lesson is this: resilience narratives do not power cities. Infrastructure does. Ignoring dependence does not make it disappear. It only ensures that strategic decisions are made on incomplete information. When intelligence communities prioritize inspiration over accuracy, they cease to function as early warning systems. They become amplifiers of hope, and hope is not a strategy. From where I sit, the most dangerous aspect of this war is not Russian missiles or drones, but Washington's habit of believing its own recycled assumptions. The winter strikes and resulting blackouts should have forced a serious reassessment of U.S. strategy. Instead, they were absorbed into a familiar loop of self-deception. Officials acknowledged the attacks, condemned them, and then returned to the same optimistic assessments about momentum and inevitability. That is not a strategy. That is institutional inertia reinforced by selective intelligence use. The loop works like this. Intelligence reporting highlights Ukrainian resilience and Russian brutality. Policymakers cite those reports to justify existing policies. Analysts then internalize the policy preference and shape future assessments accordingly. Over time, dissenting analysis disappears, not because it is disproven, but because it is unwelcome. I have watched this process hollow out intelligence organizations before, and the symptoms are unmistakable. Complexity is reduced, uncertainty is minimized, and negative indicators are explained away as temporary or irrelevant. Winter infrastructure strikes should have disrupted that loop. They demonstrated Russian capacity to sustain long-range attacks, adapt to air defenses, and impose recurring civilian stress despite sanctions and battlefield losses. Instead of triggering hard questions about leverage and end states, they were framed as evidence that Russia was morally isolated and strategically failing. Moral isolation does not stop missiles. Intelligence professionals know this, but saying it out loud carries risk. The strategic consequence of Washington's self-deception is escalation without leverage. Aid packages grow, rhetoric hardens, and timelines stretch, all while assuming that pressure alone will eventually force a favorable outcome. What is missing is a clear articulation of how continued suffering translates into strategic gain. Intelligence should be forcing that conversation Instead, it often smooths it over, presenting confidence where there should be conditionality. This loop also damages credibility beyond Ukraine. Global audiences are not blind. They see repeated assurances that certain measures will change Russian behavior, followed by evidence that behavior remains largely unchanged. When predictions fail, trust erodes. That erosion does not announce itself loudly, but it accumulates, just like infrastructure damage in winter. The hard lesson is that self-deception is a strategic liability. When intelligence becomes a mirror reflecting policy preferences instead of a lens revealing uncomfortable realities, leaders lose the ability to adapt. Wars do not end because one side feels righteous. They end because costs, capabilities, and choices converge. Ignoring that convergence does not delay it. It only ensures it arrives on unfavorable terms. By the time winter strikes became routine rather than shocking, and the pattern was unmistakable, Russia continued to apply pressure through missiles, drones, and infrastructure disruption, while Washington responded with more aid, more sanctions, and more declaratory resolve. What was missing was evidence that these responses altered Russian operational behavior in any meaningful way. From an intelligence standpoint, that gap matters more than rhetoric. Escalation is only effective if it changes the adversary's cost-benefit calculation. In this case, there is little sign that it has. Sanctions were supposed to degrade Russia's ability to sustain complex weapons programs. Yet months into successive sanction packages, Russia continued to launch large-scale barrages, adapting procurement methods and prioritizing production. Air defenses were expected to blunt these attacks decisively. Instead, they mitigated damage but did not prevent systemic disruption. Intelligence assessments that framed these measures as near-term solutions confused mitigation with denial. That confusion filtered upward into policy. The problem is not effort, it is leverage. Escalation without leverage is noise. Each additional weapons transfer or sanctions announcement is treated as a step closer to resolution, but the operational indicators do not support that belief. Russia absorbs the measures, adjusts, and continues. Intelligence reporting often notes adaptation in passing, then pivots back to reassurance. What it rarely does is ask whether the current trajectory actually constrains Russian choices or merely hardens them. The strategic consequence of this dynamic is strategic drift. The United States increases its commitment while losing clarity about outcomes. Ukrainian cities remain exposed to winter pressure, civilians endure repeated outages, and the war settles into a grind that favors the actor willing to accept long-term costs. Intelligence should be identifying who is better positioned for that grind. Instead, it often frames endurance as evenly distributed or morally guaranteed. From my experience, this is how wars become longer and harder than anticipated. Leaders escalate incrementally, believing each step will be decisive, while the adversary interprets the same steps as confirmation that endurance is working. The winter infrastructure strikes fit neatly into this pattern. They signal that Russia believes time and pressure remain viable tools, regardless of Western responses. The hard lesson is blunt. Escalation is not a strategy if it lacks leverage. Intelligence exists to measure leverage honestly, not to inflate confidence. When assessments fail to distinguish between activity and effect, policy drifts, costs rise, and the end state recedes. When I step back and look at the winter strikes, the blackouts, the deaths, and the endless cycle of response, what stands out most is not Russian brutality, but the quiet collapse of American strategic credibility. Credibility in intelligence is not about moral posture. It is about being right often enough that others take your assessment seriously. In Ukraine, that credibility has been steadily eroded by a pattern of confident predictions followed by stubbornly contradictory realities. Each time Russian infrastructure strikes were framed as a last gasp, and then repeated months later, credibility took another hit. Each time sanctions were described as decisive and then absorbed, credibility weakened further. Global audiences noticed. Allies adjusted expectations quietly. Adversaries learned that American narratives were more aspirational than predictive. This is not a failure of values, it is a failure of analysis. Intelligence credibility erodes when assessment becomes advocacy. The winter campaign should have forced a recalibration. Instead, it exposed how deeply narrative management had replaced strategic honesty. When intelligence products reassure rather than inform, they lose their warning function. Surprise returns, not because events are unpredictable, but because they are inconvenient to acknowledge in advance. The strategic consequence of this credibility collapse extends beyond Ukraine. In a multipolar world, states compare notes. They watch how the United States assesses conflicts, how often those assessments align with outcomes, and how willing Washington is to revise assumptions. When revision is rare and rhetoric is constant, trust declines. That decline limits coalition building, weakens deterrence, and encourages adversaries to test boundaries. From an intelligence realist perspective, this is the most serious damage inflicted by the war. Missiles can be replaced, power grids can be repaired. Credibility, once lost, is far harder to restore. It requires admitting error, tolerating dissent, and abandoning comforting narratives. None of those come easily to large bureaucracies under political pressure. The hard lesson is unavoidable. Intelligence becomes fiction when it is bent to serve strategy rather than to shape it. The winter strikes on Ukraine were not just attacks on infrastructure, they were stress tests for Western intelligence integrity, and the results were not reassuring. Until analysis is allowed to challenge policy rather than echo it, American strategic narratives will continue to collapse under the weight of reality.